sometimes they need a bit of support, and other times we need to step back and let them be the heroes of their story. This is the why factor. This is why I'm in this. This is what is so crucial and why it needs to be changed. I want to see that there's impact, that I can point back to something and say, this law has changed.
It's the One Podcast.
What's up, guys? Got a new podcast today. Doing it in the studio. Better sound quality, better camera quality. Let me know if you like it. And this is with Nick Evans. He's a NonProfit founder. So it might be interesting if you have that personal kind of desire to get involved in the cause. This one's a little more professional as well. How to run a nonprofit, the logistics of it, how it's different from a regular business, and all sorts of other stuff around that about Nick's journey. So watch this and enjoy. We've got a new episode of the One Podcast here with Nick Evans. He's actually a nonprofit kind of owner who's been doing his company for 10 years. We haven't had anybody who's been in the nonprofit space. It's been all for-profit kind of entrepreneurs, but we've been talking a lot about kind of the motive and being into a cause in general. So I think this is going to be an interesting podcast, and also just get into logistics of how that company works, how it's different than a for-profit company, given that you followed a similar entrepreneurial track to, I think, a lot of people beyond the nonprofit piece. But in any case, Nick, do you want to just give a quick intro to yourself and to your company, kind of what you guys do?
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks, Chris. Really glad to be with you today. So our vision is to ensure that vulnerable children have safe, loving families, which can sound pretty aspirational, pretty grand, but we break that down into two main areas through action and advocacy. So the action is those direct on the ground programs that bring impact and change, work we're doing in South Sudan, in Kenya, in the Ukraine, all the way over to Australia, and also here in New York. And then the other side is the advocacy, the campaigns that we run, whether it's with partners at the UN, partners at UNICEF, partners all across the globe, really, who want to step up and bring change, whether it be laws, whether it be legislative change, whether it be funding, whether it be best practice reform, really ensuring that takes place. Sometimes that has looked like work we've done around the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Goals. Other times it's looked like going after a very specific law that we want to see change, or resolution that we want to see change. So action and advocacy are our two main sort of pillars. And then underneath that, we have innovation and impact. So we want to make sure that everything we do has innovation at its core. It's finding a new and a better way of doing it, and that ultimately does result in an impact. That it's not just another campaign for the sake of it, but we can point to something tangibly that was changed. So that's really at the heart of what we're about.
Got it. Cool. So Nick, just to get into it, what was your professional career background? Obviously, I think people would think in terms of nonprofits, you have to be like divinely inspired to do it, or do you have to have some sort of cause of action? So what were you initially doing in your professional career, and how did that kind of lead into this, getting involved in this whole issue?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I've always had a sense of calling, if you will, passion, purpose around the most vulnerable. That's been at the heart of what has always inspired me in my work. And that looked like sometimes working in prisons and police stations, working as a drug treatment therapist. Other times it's looked like managing services in England, and particularly in the northwest of England, in Liverpool, and then across the northwest of England from the Scottish border down to the Welsh border and over towards Manchester. And that would be running whole systems of services, really, whether it's drug treatment, criminal justice, people services, bloodborne virus services. But really what got me to where I'm at right now was doing that work and loving it, thinking this is powerful, but over time, getting more and more frustrated that I wasn't seeing the change I wanted to see, or that there was almost a sense that if we do the same thing, we're going to get a new result. And that's almost like the definition of madness. You need to do something different if you're going to get a different result. And often in the social work, nonprofit space, people have got beautiful big hearts, want to do a lot of good, but sometimes can just be reinventing the wheel. Yeah. And so we wanted to find better ways. So that's why, as I said at the beginning, and talked about innovation and impact, why that focus on innovation has been so core to our work.
Yeah.
Always finding those key examples of where we can bring change that hasn't happened up to that point, and we can really ensure that it is happening.
Got it. So you had that kind of, had the social work focus.
Yep.
Just generally interested in that, and the work was rewarding, et cetera. How did I understand how you solve problems. How did you get involved with this particular issue as far as like the global orphan crisis? And
Yeah. So I connected with my co-founder. I was living in England at the time,
okay,
and they reached out to me and we talked about this vision. We sat down at a coffee shop in London and started discussing ideas and saying, wouldn't it be amazing if we could create an organization that did something different, that brought something new into the space? In this space, you've got a lot of old actors who have been in the field for 150 years and who are doing great work, responding to serious disasters happening in some of the most poor and deprived parts of the world. However, if you're always dealing with those kind of crisis situations, which is very admirable, not for a second criticizing it. I did that myself many years. But if you're always dealing that, it's hard to be focusing on innovation, because innovation and that entrepreneurial approach requires taking a risk. And it also requires allowing yourself that you may fail. And unless you're open to that idea that you could fail, then I don't think you're going to ever do anything particularly new. And I think that's where really what's been quite key for us setting this organization up here in New York is, could we try things that haven't been done? Could we create criteria that could assess the rigidity of the strength of that idea? And so we could throw ourselves fully into it, but also know that by trying something new, there's a risk involved. And that's what's been quite exciting in setting up Hopeland here in New York.
So you mentioned your co-founder. Were you the type of person that was always thinking about like entrepreneurship and starting your own thing? Or was that really something that sort of acutely came out of your interest in this issue and your co-founder? Or do you always see yourself as that innovator type person?
I had a journey, I think, like we all do in life, where I started wanting to test whether ideas could work, provide services. But as I said, over time, I got more frustrated with that. I think sometimes that frustration can be quite healthy because it can lead you to something better. At the time, you're pulling your hair out, you're getting annoyed, you're thinking, come on, can I see some more change here? Am I on the right career? What am I doing? But then you start to think, okay, maybe if I did something different here, maybe if I tease that out. And so I think that's where working in collaboration with my co-founder has been very key in terms of pioneering the organization, developing it, growing it, building good governance behind it so it's safe. So you're not just doing weird and wacky stuff for the sake of it, particularly when you're dealing with the most vulnerable. You don't want to hurt anyone in the process. But you want to make sure that you are doing something new, because like I said before, otherwise we're just going to keep reinventing the wheel.
Got it. Cool. So I guess, what were the first steps as far as like founding?
When I set up Hopeland, there was no staff. I don't think there was any money. In fact, I think we're almost in debt at the time because a few ideas have been thrown around, which cost money. So that was a challenge. I think it was beneficial that I'd had years in the field. So I was able to prove that I knew how to run services and I knew what would work. But bringing investors around Hopeland who believed in our vision, at the same time building a strong board. So we had governance, so we were safe. I had critical minds around us, critical friends who could say, hey, Nick, this is a great idea, or that's a terrible idea, or to launch this, you need to do X and Y, and you need to get it off the ground this way. So I really appreciated having that. And one of the things for me personally in this journey is, and in fact, it was something my old CEO said back in England. He said, Nick, feedback is a gift. And I remember for me, that was very profound. Like up to that point, I think like any young person, you can be a bit defensive. And I was a bit defensive in terms of wanting to do good work. But if I got critiqued or criticized, I felt I would
attacked.
A bit attacked. Exactly. But I remember thinking, okay, how do I push into that? How do I push into that idea that feedback is a gift? And how do I bring people around me, which is a tension when you're starting something particularly, because you get a lot of people who can criticize you. I had a lot of people say to me, Nick, this is not going to work. Hopeland's not going to succeed. And I needed to be able to bring the right kind of people who could speak into it and ignore the people who were just critical because they're just sitting in the cheap seats.
Gotcha. So I guess what founding a nonprofit and like taking those initial steps, you're not bringing in revenue, right? Or profit. So financially, just as somebody who's investing in it, or you and your co-founder, how are you like looking at that? Or how do you even plan that out without revenue? Because you have to work that into your model.
We do indeed. Yeah. In the UK, it's very heavily focused on social services, community services. In the US, there's quite a philanthropic society, quite a philanthropic community of people who recognize that part of their, and you could look at this cynical and say, well, it's just a way of avoiding giving tax to the IRS and giving it to a nonprofit. But the argument is that a lot of people want to do good and they just need that vehicle to get behind. And that was what was quite significant for us with Hopeland, finding people who were like-minded, who cared about vulnerable people, but wanted to see better ways, new ways.
Yeah.
And when we started developing some of the projects that we've been developing under those two banners of action and advocacy, we saw more people get excited by this and say, wow, you guys are doing something that's quite needed and new. And actually there's a real purpose behind this.
Got it. So at what point how many years are you doing this where it's like struggling to get people involved or to donate, et cetera, until it gets off the ground?
Yeah. The first 3-4 years were tough.
Got it.
Really tough because you're trying to prove an idea that hasn't existed yet. And you're having to speak in vision language and saying to them, this is what's going to be.
Yeah.
And they're rightly so scratching around the surface going, is it really going to be that?
Yeah.
And I'm saying, no, it is. We're going to have this project in Ukraine. We're going to do this. We're going to do this. And we're going to set this up in Kenya. We're going to create this project here in New York. Or we're going to change this law. And that's been a really wonderful journey. I guess seeing firsthand that people do care and they want to get behind it. But obviously it's my job and our team's job, to really prove the success of that. So when people are giving to it financially, they know that their money is going directly to those projects and they're going directly to better ways of working.
Got it. So what you mentioned, like those 4 buckets: advocacy. I'm blanking on the other names.
Action, advocacy, and then innovation and impact.
Okay. So logistically, what are in terms of running the company, what are the core areas you're looking at? Is it fundraising, marketing, or partnerships? And then obviously the impact side, but in terms of growing the company or getting it off the ground, what are the buckets?
Yeah. I think certainly in the early stages of setting up this organization that I'm running now, it was a large part of it was fundraising, but it was very quickly going around the loop in a sense to be able to prove that the fundraising is going to have an impact. It's going to be for something.
Got it.
Do you know what I mean?
And you have to have that kind of proof.
You've got to have that proof,
Yeah.
and you've got to then ideally, if you can, go back to the same people and say, you gave, and this is the impact. Thank you. If you want to give again, great. But we just appreciate you stepping up. And I think that was an interesting journey, because for me, I worked in England as for many years, and I had been delivering community services where you are funded to deliver X. The difference is in an entrepreneurial state is you are proving what X is, whereas X might be undefined. You're having to create the X factor where people are going to get behind this and go, wow.
Got it. Yeah. Got it. So I do want to talk about that piece of it, which is just like the marketing, the presentation, and the vision, and showing the results. But is there, in terms of getting people to donate and to fund it, how much of that is from in those first 4 struggling years? Are you doing door-to-door cold calling? Is there any of that type of stuff? So I have worked with nonprofits in the past through my agency where that was a primary means of fundraising. So are you in the weeds, like doing that type of stuff as the founder?
Yeah, certainly in the early days, you have to wear a lot of hats.
Yeah.
The early days, I had no staff. It was just me before I started bringing on some of my team. And that meant I was running the organization from the governance point of view, to New York charity law, to all the different aspects that kept us safe and accountable, right through to writing the speeches that we deliver to the people, sending out the invites for events, getting people behind the ideas of what we were developing. And so a lot of it was events based. New York has got quite a culture of people gathering around galas, social gatherings to hear ideas. And a lot of that came down to people trusting me, the credibility we could bring to this, so that they could say, I'm going to bring my friends, my peers along, and they're going to hear about this, and hopefully they can step up, which is what happened, thankfully. And we're at this place where we're starting to see that vision become reality.
Nice. Okay, cool. And then I think most people don't quite understand the whole tax exempt 501c3 status, all that type of stuff. So how do you, in terms of the board, right? Like how involved is that board in like things like salary or just like the operation side of the business?
They're integral to everything, really. They're
Yeah.
very involved. This evening, I've got a meeting with my board, with all of them gathering together, and they provide almost the backbone, the safety of the organization. They keep you upright in the sense that they make sure that there's nothing untoward without it. They keep me accountable, and that's great. I think sadly, sometimes people can be critical of nonprofits and things like that. And sometimes there's that's warranted. Other times it's not warranted. Right. And I think building a strong, robust board that can critically analyze you, that can ask you tough questions, being proactive in terms of having audits also is really important, and making sure that every dollar can be accounted for. So that's been a big part of us. And I'm really thankful that nearly coming up to 10 years in, we've been able to prove that money has had that impact, and we've got a very good, robust board behind us.
Yeah, the people that I know who've set up foundations or nonprofits that are most successful, they usually have a great network coming in, which I'm assuming your career helped you there. Because the board is like the piece number one of it, maybe, you know what I'm saying? But when you get out of that, the tough 3 or 4 years starting off, I imagine like now at this point, you have your website, you have all the trappings of a presence. How do you begin to make yourself known in terms of marketing or partnerships or getting to the word of the impact out there?
Yeah, I'll answer that in 2 parts, because I think part of it, you're asking about that sort of overcoming that early stage. And I think the thing that I felt when I started this organization was that a lot of it would be about willpower. I needed to be able to keep pushing, fighting, and making it happen and driving it. And over time, I realized actually a lot of it's about why power, going back to the why. Why are you in the job? What do you care about? Because that's your motivation. That's what keeps you fresh. That's what keeps you humble. That's what keeps you looking and innovating and creating and exploring what can be done, rather than just becoming dogged and in a rigid way and finding that you're just pushing without receiving, like I said before, that feedback. And so for me, often when I've struggled, going back to that why power, why did we set it up? Reminding myself, and I was fortunate having years of working in community centers, in prisons, in police stations, in some of the most vulnerable cities, and seeing some of the most vulnerable communities and going, how do we bring the change for those people? And that is going to motivate me to move forward. I think where we're at right now, leading on to the second part of your question, we're at the point now where we're able to communicate the success of our work. You said we've got all those kind of key ingredients to prove that, but we can't get complacent. We've got to be looking at better ways to communicate it, new ways to find ways to show what is our impact, why are we having an impact, what is going on for us that is worth shouting out to the world about.
Got it. Cool. So what do you do advertising? Do you do celebrity or influencer partnerships? I know that's a big thing for a lot of nonprofits, but is there, I'm sure there's many different ways, but is there a predominant way that your organization is focused on?
Yeah. One thing every nonprofit receives here in the US is Google Ad Grant, which is a very simple tool.
Oh yeah, I remember that. I've done that for self companies. What is it, 10 grand or something like
exactly.
that?
That's right. Yeah. So that's a part of it, making sure the content you're producing can be pushed out to different audiences. We've worked with different partners and influencers to get the message out. We've had to be very discerning to think, who do we want to work with? I think I
saw Coldplay or something on the site, or
we've worked with a number of different partners who have been really significant in terms of getting the message out, which has been great. And we've been fortunate that they've come on board, and other partners, and said, we care about this issue. We want to support you.
Got it.
And our job is then giving them really good content so they can point to it and say, hey, you get behind this. This is how you can bring change.
So you have to research, just make sure you're aligned with them, and then the presentation is all kind of clear for them so that they get what they want out of it.
Yeah. If they're trusting you to put up the content, then you've got to step up, and we've got to step up. So and I think that's sometimes what happens with nonprofits is, because it's this idea of it being a nonprofit, there's almost this sort of idea that it can be substandard work.
Yeah.
And it can't be.
Yeah, there definitely is.
It has to be at that level. And that's where I think we've not really worked in many respects like a nonprofit. We tried to work like a for-profit, although everything we raise goes back into the organization like a for-profit should. We're trying to think about how do we create that quality of content that we know people would be proud of.
Got it. And how do you, how much of the work is logistical? So I know there's Blackbot is like a CRM for nonprofits where you manage fundraising, links.
Yeah.
So how, do you have to hire people to manage that, just like the actual functions of managing the different donors and the different all the information.
Absolutely. We've used a number of different CRM tools over the years and found from Salesforce through to many others that have been useful and some less. And I think we're continually looking at those tools. And part of the benefit for me is having a good network of other CEOs to be able to pick the brains and say, hey, what are you guys using? What's working well? Because there's new content and new technology coming out all the time. Nonprofits have to be on top of that and know what's coming out and be able to respond to it. Because sometimes you could be totally missing a trick. You could go out and cold call to a new partner and fail to realize that all the sort of intel behind that individual is already available through a good CRM. And if you're smart about this, you can actually have a much better play and a much better chance of success.
I do have a follow-up on that, but I think it's a lot of early stage entrepreneurs, they have a misconception of a nonprofit in that they think that the money's coming in from the fundraising, you don't have to do anything for it, and then you're marketing. But there's actually like a lot of the standard business stuff, like sales processes, automations that you have to do because they're essentially your customers and you have something you're delivering to them.
Indeed.
Do you ever buy a customer, like potential donor data or something? Is that like a thing that's done?
A number of the different tools now have that built into it.
Got it.
And a lot of the CRMs are actually, it's becoming more normalized for literally to be that you can have got a search function within them. Whereas I think 5-10 years ago, that was more of a foreign idea. And that's my point about how do we stay on top of those different technological advancements? Because they are just becoming more and more standard now.
Are you ever doing like significant email campaigns and things like of that?
We do indeed. Keeping in contact with our supporters is really important. And whether we're using any one of the different tools you can use to send out massive emails, obviously.
Do cold outreach though? No.
We've tended not to, because I feel like we're a relatively young organization. And so I think we may do in the future, but I think at this point, a lot of it is about building on our existing network, cultivating that, helping them know that they've supported us. And by supporting us, they've had an impact. And I think that's really important, because I think otherwise donors can feel a little bit like you move on from them very quickly when you find something more shiny. And I think honoring those supporters is really important to say, you've stepped up and here's why, and here's the impact year on year.
Got it. You mentioned before the why power thing. So I guess what your point there, what is related to, and this is something that we talk about, but basically a lot of you need a reason for being, and hard work. You want to enjoy the work, number one, right? Hard work, discipline thing, it only gets you so far. You know what I'm saying? So you need to have that. So were you always thinking about that? Was that something that you cultivated after you started the company, or is that you had beforehand?
Yeah, it's a good question. I remember I read a book by John Maxwell where he talked about this idea of the why power. And it was quite profound for me, because it made me think, okay, how do I stay fresh? And the reason why I say that is because a lot of times people in the nonprofit space get burnt out. It's just very common. And actually CEOs in the nonprofit space, there's actually a sort of a number of networks across the US that are developing just to stop CEO burnout in nonprofit space. As they come in, there can be this misconception that I've done my MBA, I'm going to jump into that. And then they realize that actually, no, it's like running a business. And sometimes it can be harder because if you've got a product which you're selling and you know it's selling, and you've got a good pipeline and you're cultivating that pipeline, you've got a business model that can be sustainable. Whereas in the nonprofit, particularly in the startup world, you're having to prove it. And the fail rate is so high in terms of new nonprofits starting up and fizzling out. So because of that, I was very intentional thinking, okay, how do I stay fresh? How do I keep the ideas coming in? And that's where, for me, the why power. Obviously, you want to have strong willpower. You need to have that. You need to be able to push. You need to be able to dig and keep digging for gold until you find it. And sometimes you feel like you've got to dig in a lot of places. And other times you just got to keep digging deeper. And so it's that process of just getting out there and continually do that. But always going back to the why, because that keeps you fresh.
So 10 years ago, when I started my marketing agency, I did a lot of nonprofit clients, social media, designs. And the one thing that I recognized from that, which is not true of regular businesses, is the visuals, like the brand, how things are being conveyed, the designs are very important to the founders. Whereas I noticed that CEOs of like SaaS companies or consulting agencies or something, like they don't really care that their website looks good or like their headshots look good. And I was even noticing when we set up the podcast today, that was a very important thing for you. So do you notice that? Do you want to talk a little bit about how like that, your perception is, because it's not like Apple or Amazon could be doing some illicit things, right? But nobody really cares as long as the product's good.
Yeah. Do you mean from an integrity point of view?
Not necessarily integrity point of view, but just like that the vision and the, you know what I'm saying? The visuals and the way things look and appear is very important because people perceive, the way they perceive you is essentially, you know.
Oh, I think that's very true. And I think particularly, like we talked before about in the nonprofit space, the image is that you can do things substandard and that would be acceptable.
Right.
And I think for us, we wanted to move away from that. We were like, no, we want to have quality in how we're working.
Yeah.
We don't want to waste money in the process, and that's where for us, in many cases, having pro bono consultants, designers, graphic designers come on board for us. Sometimes it's either pro bono or low bono, a fee that where you're covering costs, but you're ensuring that the quality is good, because I think people want to see something which is appealing. And also I think it's moving away from this image of and this is quite true to the brand of Hopeland. The vision behind Hopeland was to build a land of hope.
Yeah.
It was to build a new land for vulnerable children where they could know hope and safety and love and nurturing and care. But it's hard to do that if the branding is so poor and looks so crummy that people can't really see that to get that vision in their mind. And I think that was for us what was quite key in the early days of Hopeland was how do we communicate something that is beautiful, that is engaging, and that also moves away from the image. The reality is there's horrendous suffering around the world, and you can focus on that. It's important to recognize that. But if you're going to be aspiring to something better, then I think people often get excited by that aspiration of saying, we can help those most vulnerable people, like the work we're doing in South Sudan. I think it's the newest country in the world right now. And it's hugely affected by severe flooding, by climate change, by major wars, which are causing huge displacement of people. But you can see such beauty in that place where you see lives being transformed by innovative solutions, and not just innovative because it's trendy or cool, but innovative because you're finding better ways to working that are lifting up local communities, empowering them. And you see a smile on a child, and it is a beautiful smile because they're not continually staying in this bleak situation. And a lot of nonprofits have felt that the best approach is to go down that route of the child with the mosquitoes around the eye and the blowing up stomach. And forgive the expression, but I'm not sure of a better one, but it's that poverty porn image. Do you know what I mean? Let's focus on the poverty porn idea. And I think while people can be stirred by that and motivated by that, I think the challenge with that in the longer term is that people want to see there's some change. That's why, to your point about finding the right kind of brand and the image and getting that right is important, and really working hard on aspiring to that, not for a vanity point of view or looking cool, but because I think for people to feel hopeful, which is what we want to create in Hopeland, you need to show that change is possible.
Got it. Okay, cool. So a little bit of a different question. So one thing that we talk about a lot with entrepreneurship is like the mental side of it, right? Staying in the game and the stress of it as well.
Yeah.
But do you ever feel like running a company is stressful if you have employees and clients and customers to satisfy, but I can only imagine like there's more mental kind of stress or pressure when there's like real people's lives are impacted. My client is making $10 million a year. You know what I'm saying? It's again, they're paying you money, but you're not personally invested in it the same way that you are when it's like people who are suffering and there's a real world massive impact. So obviously there's excitement to that, but there's also stress. Do you ever feel like you regret starting a nonprofit and you would have rather done like a B Corp or a for-profit company, or is that never the case?
No, it's just never been the case, really. I'm really thankful for what I do. I love it. And I feel really privileged and just so pleased that I get to do this.
Nice.
But I think it is for me. I think if I was a nonprofit for nonprofit's sake, it would do my head in. I'd get totally fed up. That's a very British expression, doing your head in. Probably not as common for our US audience. Does your head in. But it's the equivalent would be fed up or frustrated or annoyed. And I don't want to be a nonprofit for nonprofit's sake. I want to see that there's impact, that I can point back to something and say, this law has changed. There are now children in New York City who are being empowered in the foster care system that weren't being. There are now people in South Sudan who's receiving this. There's now children in Ukraine who were being caught behind in conflict zones who have now been rescued and brought back to their families. And all these things I can now point to, thank God, and which I wouldn't have been able to point to if we hadn't set Hopeland up. And I think that's for us where those success points are vital, and keep searching after them so that we can keep ourselves true to our cause, which is building that land of hope.
Yeah. Where you're in at this point, 10 years in, what's like the biggest challenge or
biggest challenge? Ooh, good question.
For the organization as a whole.
Yeah. I think fundraising is always a challenge. We always need to be raising money. If anyone's listening and wants to give, go to www.ourhopeland.org. Yep.
Description.
Thank you. But that's always a big part of it. But that's a big part of it. I think also for us, because we've got an aspirational vision around innovation and impact being what our work is about, is finding people who want to work like that. So as a result of that, all my staff so far have come from corporate backgrounds. I don't think I've recruited anyone who's had a really strong non-profit focus. So I've had people who have worked at major corporations in different areas of finance and different areas of business and politics, but not necessarily in the nonprofit space. So we're unique in that respect, in the sense I've not to date, maybe in the future I may do, but up till now I've not recruited a single person from the nonprofit space, because I want to find people who can the best people and the brightest people. And there's a lot of those people are in the nonprofit space. I'm not ragging on them. They're great.
Yeah.
But if you want to create something new, if you genuinely want to do that, then you've got to find new thinkers. And that's where we've had to be quite purposeful on that.
Got it. So let me throw a hypothetical situation out there. So let's say there's somebody out there who is working in the for-profit space, okay? But they have a cause that they really care about, and they want to pursue that. Would you recommend starting a nonprofit, or like going full-time with that? Or like, how should they, if somebody's in that position where they're not in the industry, you know what I'm saying? How do they manage that?
Yeah, I think come and speak to me and we can talk about it.
Nice.
Because I think there's two parts to it. I think sometimes without a context of what's going on, you can do more harm than help, which is possible.
Yeah.
Other times, if you're someone who can listen and understand the situation, then you can do a heck of a lot of good in bringing something new to the space. And I'll explain what I mean by that. A lot of times I've worked with people who have got a finance background and they're incredibly smart and need them to be those critical friends in the journey. Other times there's people who are in business or consulting, and I've brought them on board and they've been able to look at what we're doing and say to me, Nick, I think you could do this 10 times better if you did X, Y, and Z. And they may not have had those insights if they hadn't worked with one of the big four or in some of those kind of capacities. Exactly. And I think that's where I've been really intentional, bringing those kind of organizations around our work and inviting them into the journey with us, because they can bring that insight. And so I think it's both. I think, yes, definitely bring those new skills into the space, into the sector, because we desperately need it. But also, I've seen people who have just done an MBA and say, now I'm going to run a nonprofit, and done a terrible job because they've not understand what's going on. They've gone into meetings and said all the wrong things and been pretty ignorant to the situation. And I'm personally one of those people that think we need to move away from thinking that everything in the nonprofit is sacred. I don't think it's sacred. I think we should be able to scrutinize. I think we should be able to ask the tough questions. Do you know what I mean? And as in the sector, we need to not be defensive. But I think at the same time, people who are coming in, you can learn a lot when you sit with a vulnerable person. You can learn a heck of a lot. You might think that giving them a blanket is what they need, or you might think that doing some kind of other act is what they need. And actually, you could be causing that situation to become even worse because you're not understanding the complexity of it. Then you're not seeing the bigger picture. And I think that's what, for me, really helped with having years in the space, because I could understand those issues. And I'm still trying to understand those. I can't get complacent. When I felt, and this kind of relates to your question before, where you said, how do you keep yourself fresh, or being a number of years in? For me, when I'm feeling like I need to stay fresh and keep fresh, I will go and sit in the community center with a bunch of people who are struggling, or I'll get myself to Moldova in Eastern Europe, or spend time in Rwanda and understand the issues. And then that immediately brings me back to a very healthy place and go, okay, this is the why factor. This is why I'm in this. This is what is so crucial and why it needs to be changed.
Got it. Wrapping up here, any takeaways or what are the biggest takeaways
from setting up the organization?
From the whole 10 years running it?
That it's awesome, exhausting. You've got to stay fresh.
Okay.
For me, it's finding things that I love to get out and do on the weekends, whether that's working out, whether that's surfing or snowboarding. But it's also, for me, like I said, it's other times being fortunate enough just to sit with people who are in a difficult spot and empathize with their situation.
Right.
And ultimately help increase their agency to lift them out of that situation, where it's not just the best nonprofit work isn't just some person helicoptering in, fixing their problem. It's empowering that person and knowing that they have within them the skills and the resources they need to do that. Sometimes they need a bit of support, and other times we need to step back and let them be the heroes of their story rather than us trying to take that position from them.
Got it.
Because many times they can actually do amazing work.
Got it. Nick, where can people find you, and how can they donate or get involved with Hopeland?
Great question. So if you go to www.hopeland.org, and we can put that up on the screen, and there's a chance to donate within that. If you want to get in touch, you can send us through your details. We'd love to talk to you and find how people can bring their expertise. We're always looking for smart people who want to get around this issue.
And if somebody's looking to form a nonprofit and they might be looking for a mentor, any personal way to get in touch with you, not to overflood, but
yeah, if you go through the site, happy to jump on a quick call and talk about where you're at.
Cool. Sounds good. Nick, thanks for coming on.
Pleasure. Thank you.
Cool.